Hi, I'm Matthew Lapp, host of Matthew Lapp Train Guy Segment Show. Also today in this segment, I'm at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri. The National Museum of Transportation is located on 2933 Barrett Station Road in St. Louis, Missouri, and to check when the museum is open, do check the website for information about that. It is closed on major holidays. The museum was once the Missouri Pacific Kirkwood Yard until later it became a museum. In 1944, the National Museum of Transportation was founded by a group wanting to preserve historic transportation artifacts. After acquiring an 1870s mule-drawn streetcar, they formed the St. Louis Railway Historical Society. The present site was identified for the museum. More streetcars were added, as well as a number of steam locomotives, and the collection continued to grow to include antique cars, boats, planes, and trains. It was taken over by the St. Louis County Parks Department in 1979 and remains a great collection with some unusual pieces. Also, the most transportation you'll find in the museum is trains, and it even has trains for display, and some you can even ride, like the miniature train you'll find at the bottom of the hill, and vintage trolleys as well. In 2012, the Orthwyn Center was finished being constructed, and it is at the bottom of the hill on the museum grounds. Today it houses train-related exhibits. Also, it is where admission can be purchased inside. As well as that, the depot just near the other parking lot is also where you can purchase admission. In 2018, there was a plan to renovate the grounds. The museum was just known as the Museum of Transportation originally till it was renamed the National Museum of Transportation, and was likely in 2018 when that happened. What you see right behind me is Bellefontain Railway 33. Bellefontain Railway 33 was built by the Andrew White Car Company in St. Louis, Missouri between 1870 and 1875 and is a mule-drawn streetcar. This car worked between downtown St. Louis and Bellefontaine in North St. Louis County until 1895. Passengers entered the car through the rear door and paid a nickel fare by placing it in the front wall. Also, the car had no heater. In the winter, the company spent 3 cents a day for straw to cover the floor, and 2.5 cents a day lit the 2 oil lamps. Literally known as the B Line, the Bellefontain Railway Company was formed in 1868 from the consolidation of the Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland Railroad Company and the Bellefontaine and Indiana Railroad Company. Its line eventually ran from Cleveland, Ohio to St. Louis, Missouri. The mule could only work 6 hours per day, but the driver worked much longer. After replacement by electric streetcars, this mule-drawn car was used as a trolley line waiting room. In 1921, the car was used as an example of an old car in comparison with the latest electrified ones. After this, it was put in storage until 1944 when its location was needed for other purposes and it was going to be scrapped. A small group of people who saved it formed the National Museum of Transportation, and this was the first museum exhibit, and it was also put on display in this building where it is seen today. What you see right behind me is Wabash 2847. Wabash 2847 was built by the Wabash shops in Decatur, Illinois, 1952, and is a streamlined style cupola caboose. This caboose was used many years ago on freight trains as the train crew's office when it was in service. The cupola is known to be a streamlined style and a Wabash-style streamlined cupola as well. Then, in 1964, the Wabash merged into the Norfolk and Western Railroad, and this car was likely used by that railroad as it was renumbered as 562 847 as well. Then later on, this caboose was retired and then was privately owned and sat in someone's backyard in a suburban part of St. Louis, Missouri. Then, in 2012, it came to be part of the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today, and also you can even visit the interior of the caboose as well.
You see right behind me is Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 3.
Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 3 was built by General Motors in LaGrange, Illinois in 1955 and is the 214-63 diesel locomotive built by that factory and is an LWT 12 type diesel locomotive and is an aerotrain locomotive. The locomotive was originally numbered 1000. Then it was used for the Pennsylvania Railroad and retained the number. It hauled the aerotrain set for the railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad was the first railroad to test one of the new trains in 1956. Pennsylvania Railroad was not convinced and returned the train to General Motors after a year of use. Then it was used for the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad in 1958 and pulled the aerotrain set on the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad and was used for commuter services in Chicago, Illinois as well. It was also numbered 3. This locomotive is one of 2 experimental trains that they built at the time with a new lightweight construction and low gravity concept powered by 1200 horsepower. Then in 1966 it was retired and was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. And also it used to be on the hill on the upper part of the museum, and then it was carried by a semi-truck to this spot as it is seen on display today. In 2021, it was then getting repainted until the project was completed. Also, Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 3 is one of 2 surviving aerotrains left in the world today, and the sister of this one is number 2 and is at the National Railroad Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And number 3 can be found right here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is on display today.
What you see right behind me is Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 14.
Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 14 was built by Electromotive Division in LaGrange, Illinois in 1955 and is a single-truck passenger coach. This car was used part of the aerotrain set. It is one of the original 10 cars that General Motors used lightweight construction concepts in the building along with a futuristic locomotive, which resulted in the aerotrain. The car was used by the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific after being tested by some railroads and was renumbered 14. Then it was retired and in 1966 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 27.
Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 27 was built by Electromotive Division in LaGrange, Illinois, 1956 and is a single-track passenger coach. This car was used part of the aerotrain set. It is one of the original 10 cars that General Motors used lightweight construction concepts in the building along with a futuristic locomotive which resulted in the aerotrain. The car was used by the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific after being tested by some railroads and was renumbered 27. Then it was retired and in 1966 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Missouri Pacific 604.
Missouri Pacific 604 was built by the Fagel Twin Coach Company in Kent, Ohio in 1947 and is a rail motor bus. This motor bus was used on rails and used for the Missouri Pacific Railroad, and also it was used in Houston, Texas, and it would carry people on board as well. Then later on it was retired and then came to be part of the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is Missouri Pacific 13546.
Missouri Pacific 13546 was built by the International Car Corp in Kenton, Ohio in 1972 and is a CA-29 class caboose. This caboose was used many years ago on the Missouri Pacific Railroad behind freight trains as the train crew's office when being used on the railroad as well. Then later on, this caboose was retired and was removed from service in 1986 in Sedalia, Missouri, and then was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri in 1989, where it is seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is Panama Canal Company
662. Panama Canal Company 662 was built by General Electric in Schenectady, New York in 1914 and is a canal mule. It was used to operate on the Panama Canal. It was used on the Pacific side of the canal at the Pedro Miguel locks. Power came from 220-volt AC underground contact rails which powered two 75-horsepower traction motors. Drive and braking was delivered through a toothed cogwheel on a rack rail under the locomotive, which also allowed it to climb the 44-degree inclines between lock chambers. It also ran on 5-foot gauge rails. Each mule had a winch operated by the driver, which was played in or out to keep the ship centered in the lock while moving from chamber to chamber. At first, 4 mules were used per ship, one each side at each end, but as ships grew larger, up to 10 were required. They were actually used for side-to-side and braking control in the narrow space, with forward motion through the locks provided by the ship's engines. Then later on it was retired in 1964 and was replaced by a newer model, and that same year it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today. Today, it is either one of 3 or 4 mules that still remain today, and 662 can be found here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Laclede Christy number 2.
Laclede Christy 2 was built by the Davenport Locomotive Works in Davenport, Iowa in 1907 and is the 643rd steam locomotive built by that factory and is an 040T four-wheeler type steam locomotive. Originally, it was used by the Perrington Paving Brick Company of Galesburg, Illinois, and was used for moving cars around as well. The engine was built to run on 30-inch gauge tracks. Later on, the locomotive was sold to the brick-making company Laclede Christy Clay Products and worked at the company's St. Louis, Missouri plant moving carloads of clay to brick factory. When it was bought by a company, it gained a number which was 2. In 1948, the name was changed to just Laclede Christy. Then it was retired, and in 1952 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it can be seen today. And you can also visit the locomotive's cab and sit where the engineer and fireman used to sit, and even ring the locomotive's bell.
And that's how it's done. What you see right behind me is Burlington Northern 10,032.
Burlington Northern 10,032 was built by the Northern Pacific Brainerd Shops in Brainerd, Minnesota in 1969 and is a wide vision cupola caboose. This caboose was originally built for the Northern Pacific Railroad and originally numbered 10401, and also it was used behind freight trains for many years and was the train crew's office. Then, in 1970, the Northern Pacific was merged to form the Burlington Northern Railroad, and this car was renumbered 10,032. Then, later on, this caboose was retired and came to be part of the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is on display today.
What you see right behind me is Chicago and Illinois Midland 551.
Chicago and Illinois Midland 551 was built by the Lima Locomotive Works in Lima, Ohio in 1928 and is the 7330th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 282 Mikado type steam locomotive. It was used by the Chicago and Illinois Midland Railroad for many years. Then later on the locomotive was retired, and in 1955 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today. In 2016 it was being repainted. Today it is the last surviving steam locomotive from the Chicago and Illinois Midland Railroad and is preserved at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Union Tank Line 14387.
Union Tank Line 14387 was built by the Union Tank Line Company in 1910 and is a tanker car. It was used to haul 6,500 gallons of petroleum for many years. It was used on freight trains as well, and was also used on a line of tanker cars. Then later on, it was retired, and in 1952 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the Union Tank Line Company, where it is seen on display today. Also in 2016 it was being repainted till about 2019 it was completed. Today it can be seen on display at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Union Tank Line 3882.
Union Tank Line 3882 was built by the Union Tank Line in 1936 and is a three-dome tanker car. It was used to haul liquids such as thick liquids needing to be warmed to flow easily, such as tar. Also, the car was built to hold a total of 6,600 gallons, which is 2,200 per section, or 80,000 pounds. Then later on it was retired, and in 1983 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the Union Tank Line Company, where it is seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is American Car and Foundry 26640.
American Car and Foundry 26640 was built by American Car and Foundry in Kenton, Ohio in 1960 and is a covered hopper car. This car was used to carry bulk items which needed protection from the elements, such as cement, grain, dry chemicals, and plastic pellets, which are examples of cargo might have carried before. This car was last used by the Diamond Shamrock Company to haul potassium and carbonate, and it was even used on mixed freight trains years ago, or may have been used on a line of covered hoppers just like it. Then later on, this car was retired, and in 1993 it was then donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is on display today.
You see right behind me is Monsanto Chemical 117.
Monsanto Chemical Company 117 was built by American Car Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1940 and is a nitric acid tank car. This car was designed to transport concentrated and highly corrosive nitric acid. It carried 8,000 gallons. For many years, this car was used by the Monsanto Chemical Company. Then later on, it was retired and it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it can be seen today. Also, you can even walk through the car as well.
What you see right behind me is Northern Pacific 1082.
Northern Pacific 1082 was built by the Northern Pacific Railroad shops in Brainerd, Minnesota in 1948 and is a wide vision cupola caboose. This caboose was used on the back of freight trains for many years and was used as the train crew's office as well. Then, in 1970, the railroad merged to become the Burlington Northern, and it was renumbered 10435. Then, later on, the caboose was retired and was acquired by the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, and also was repainted to look original as well. Today, it is seen on display at the museum, and also you can even check out the interior of the caboose as well.
What you see right behind me is Missouri Pacific 13889.
Missouri Pacific 13889 was built by the Missouri Pacific shops in DeSoto, Missouri in 1980 and is a transfer caboose and was assigned to UPCA 35 class. This caboose was once used as a transfer caboose for the Missouri Pacific Railroad and then the Union Pacific Railroad after the merger in 1982 and used as a maintenance of way piece as well. Then, in 2000, it was retired and was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the Union Pacific Railroad, and it can be seen on display today, and also you can walk inside the car as well.
What you see right behind me is Georgia Railroad 724.
Georgia Railroad 724 was built by Baldwin in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1869 and is the 150/38th steam locomotive built by that factory and is an 0606 wheeler type steam locomotive. Originally, it was numbered 49. Then later it was renumbered 722. Later it was renumbered 724. It also switched hopper cars of gravel when working for the Georgia Railroad. Then in 1941 it was sold to the East St. Louis Junction Railroad in National City, Illinois and renumbered 17 and several local stockyards across the Mississippi River in Illinois. Then in 1950 it was sold to St. Louis Material and Supply Company in Pacific, Missouri and kept the number. Then it was sold to Basic Materials Company and still retained the number, and it switched hopper cars of gravel there until 1963. It was the last conventional steam locomotive to regularly operate in the St. Louis area. Then later on the locomotive was retired and then in 1964 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by Basic Materials Company. And also, it got some parts repainted and got repainted different colors sometime between 1988 and the late 1990s. And also it is color coded to show people the various parts, and if you look at the board beside the locomotive, you'll see by the color legend of which part tells you where it is. The locomotive has some parts painted where you can see which part is which. In 2017, it was being repainted to show half of it original and half of it color-coded till 2019 it was completed. Also, it is the only surviving Georgia Railroad 060 left in the world today, and also can be seen here at the National Museum of Transportation and used as a good example for telling which parts are which, as each one is painted in a different color as well.
What you see right behind me is Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 6117.
Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 6117 was built by Pullman in 1917 and is a heavyweight passenger car. This coach was used in mainline and branch line service for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad many years ago, and used on heavyweight passenger trains many years ago. And it would even have people on board it as well. It was then used by the Chicago commuter train service and renumbered into the 7300 series, and I believe it was numbered 7317 as well. Then later on, this car was retired, and in 1969, it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, where it is seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 1582.
Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 1582 was built by American Car Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1916 and is a heavyweight baggage car. It was used for bagged mail, express, and baggage shipments whenever it was used on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, and used on heavyweight passenger trains many years ago as well. Then later on it was retired and then was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, like probably in the 1960s, by the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, where it is seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 1942.
Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 1942 was built by the Standard Steel Car Company in 1922 and is a heavyweight mail car. It was used as a railway post office whenever it was used for passenger service on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad many years ago. Also, the mail was picked up, sorted, and delivered in this railway car. Mail was picked up and dropped off without the train stopping and used on heavyweight passenger trains many years ago as well. Then later on the car was retired, and in 1969 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, where it is seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 9908.
Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 9908 was built by Electromotive Division in LaGrange, Illinois in 1939 and is the 96101st diesel locomotive built by that factory and is a shovel nose AA type diesel locomotive. Also, the locomotive is named Silver Charger. It was the last of the early Zephyr trains in which the car body housed the engine and doubled as a mail baggage car. Also, this locomotive hauled the General Pershing Zephyr that ran between Kansas City, Missouri and St. Louis, Missouri, and it was the last shovel-nose locomotive in service. The General Pershing Zephyr ran on its designated route until the U.S. entered World War II, when it began to work on other routes. It also hauled other trains after the other cars in the train set were withdrawn. Then later on, this locomotive was retired, and in 1966 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad and it can be seen on display at the museum where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Baltimore, Ohio 50.
Baltimore, Ohio 50 was built by General Motors in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1935 and is the 532nd diesel locomotive built by that factory and is an EMD 1800 horsepower BB type diesel locomotive. It is one of 5 experimental 1800 horsepower passenger diesel locomotives built and were the first non-articulated diesels to work on the United States mainline railroads. It was used to haul the Baltimore and Ohio's Royal Blue passenger train. Then, in 1938, it was transferred to the Chicago and Alton Railroad, which is Baltimore and Ohio's subsidiary, and renumbered 1200. And it even hauled the Chicago and Alton's Abraham Lincoln passenger train. And also it served in local freight service and on the Joliet commuter train. Then, in 1958, the locomotive was retired and was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by General Motors, General Electric, and Hyman Michaels Company and can be seen on display right here where it is today.
What you see right behind me is New York Central 113.
New York Central 113 was built by Alco and General Electric in Schenectady, New York in 1906 and is the 299/48th electric locomotive built by Alco and the 2113th built by General Electric and is an S2 type electric locomotive. Originally, this locomotive was used by the New York Central Railroad and numbered 3413. In 1908, it was renumbered 3213. Then in 1917, it was renumbered 1113. Then in 1936, it was renumbered 113. Then in 1963, it was retired and was acquired by the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is seen today. Also, New York Central 113 is one of 2 S2 type electric locomotives surviving today, and New York Central 115 lettered and numbered as Penn Central 4715 is the other one and is on display at the Illinois Railway Museum in Union, Illinois, and New York Central 113 is here on display at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it can be seen today.
What you see right behind me is Illinois Terminal
1575. Illinois Terminal 1575 was built by the Illinois Traction System Shops in Decatur, Illinois in 1918 and is an electric box cab locomotive and is a Class B electric locomotive. It was powered by 4 GE 69C motors. This locomotive was designed to haul freight, and the railroad it worked on was originally known as the Illinois Traction, and it has always carried this number. Then, the Illinois Traction was renamed the Illinois Terminal Railroad in 1937. Then later on, it was sold to the St. Louis Car Company division of General Steel Industries in 1935. Then, later on, it was retired, and in 1963, it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the St. Louis Car Division of General Steel Industries. And in like the 1980s, it was being repainted till 2007 or 2008, and then in 2015 to 2016, the roof was being cosmetically restored. Also, it can be seen in this spot in the museum where it can be seen today. Also, Illinois Terminal 1575 is one of 2 surviving Class B electric box cab locomotives left in the world today, and 1565 is the other one and is seen at the Illinois Railway Museum in Union, Illinois, and 1575 can be found here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is seen today.
What you see right behind me is Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul E2.
Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul E2 was built by General Electric in Schenectady, New York in 1919 and is the 6979th electric locomotive built by that factory and is a bipolar type electric locomotive. This locomotive is one of 5 of this type built and numbered from E1 to E5. It was built to pull transcontinental passenger trains through the Cascade Mountains. Also, it is a 1 plus B dash D dash D dash B plus 1 gearless bipolars, which means 12 traction motors are mounted directly on the driving axle, thus eliminating the use of gears, and 1 plus B dash D dash D dash B plus 1 means there are 4 sets of articulated axles under the unit. At each end, there is 1 unpowered axle and 2 powered axles, hinged to a set of 4 powered axles. 2 of these articulated units are placed back to back and connected by a hinge, and this arrangement was used by the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad. Then later on it was retired and in 1961 was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it can be seen on display today. Also, Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul E2 is the only surviving bipolar locomotive left in the world today and can be found here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is City of St. Louis Water Division 1.
City of St. Louis Water Division 1 was built by the Whitcomb Locomotive Works in Rochelle, Illinois in 1924 and is the 11744th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is a 15-ton switcher type diesel locomotive. This locomotive worked at St. Louis City's Howard Bend Water Plant in St. Louis, Missouri. Then later on worked for St. Louis Department of Parks and Recreation, and it was numbered 1. Then, in 1978, it was bought by the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, and restored as it was when it worked for the Water Division as well, and can be seen on display in this spot where it is today.
What you see right behind me is United States Army 1149.
United States Army 1149 was built by the Davenport Bessler Corp. in 1952 and is the 3437th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is a 1B1 experimental 35-ton direct drive turbine type diesel locomotive. The locomotive is also powered by 2 Boeing 502 2E 150 HP jet engines. It was also tested by the Army in Fort Eustis, Virginia. It was then sold to Railroad Construction Company in 1956. Then later on it was retired. It was then donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri in 1980, and today it can be seen on display in this spot where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Spokane, Portland, and Seattle 884.
Spokane, Portland, and Seattle 884 was built by the Northern Pacific Railway Shops in Brainerd, Minnesota in 1954 and is an all-steel cupola caboose. This caboose was originally used for the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railroad, and this is the original number. It was used as the train crew's office and was used on the back of freight trains for the railroad as well. Then when the railroad merged to the Burlington Northern Railroad in 1970, it was renumbered 11436. It was last used out of Eola Yard, which is near Aurora, Illinois. Then later on it was retired and in 1983 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the Burlington Northern Railroad and was repainted to its original look as how it originally looked as well. In 2015, it was being cosmetically restored to like 2017, and also, as it's on display, you can also visit the interior of the caboose as well.
What you see right behind me is Trailer Train 130-059.
Trailer Train 130-059 was built by United American in 1984 and is a piggyback flat car. This car was designed to haul semi-trailers. Also, it was even seen being used on freight trains like Burlington Northern, Santa Fe, CSX, Norfolk Southern, or Union Pacific, or any railroads it rolled on many years ago. Then, later on, this car was retired and was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the Trailer Train Corp., where it is seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is Frisco 3000.
Frisco 3000 was built by the St. Louis-San Francisco Railway, shops in Springfield, Missouri in 1960, and is an automobile carrier. This auto carrier was used for hauling vehicles on board and would carry cars on the lower level, middle level, and upper level. This one was used on the St. Louis-San Francisco Railroad, Frisco for short, and would be used on a line of auto carriers of its type. This car is the first tri-level auto rack ever built to carry automobiles. Due to vandalism of the automobiles, this type of open car was replaced by enclosed auto transporters. Then later on it was retired, and in 1977 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the St. Louis-San Francisco Railroad, Frisco for short, and can be seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is General American Transportation Company 96500.
General American Transportation Company 96500 was built by General American Transportation Corp. in 1965 and is a whale belly tanker car. Also, this car is known to be the world's largest railroad tanker car. It is used for experimental purposes, transporting anhydrous ammonia and LP gas, and it also carried 60,200 gallons. Also, it was used on freight trains in the past as it was the largest tanker car in the world and used on mixed freight trains as well. Then later on, the car was retired, and in 1971, it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the General American Transportation Corp., and it can be seen here on display where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Sabine River Northern 408.
Sabine River Northern 408 was built by Electromotive Division in LaGrange, Illinois in 1937 and is the 651st diesel locomotive built by that factory and is an NC-type diesel locomotive. This locomotive is only one of 5 of this model that were built, and this is the only one not repowered with a 567 engine. This diesel was used for shunting and like hauling freight trains and was originally built for the Youngstown and Northern, which is a U.S. Steel line, and it was renumbered 202. Then in 1946 it was traded to the Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern Railroad and then was renumbered 408. Then in 1955 it was sold to the Marinette Tomahawk and Western, but retained the number. Then in 1965 it was sold to the Sabine River and Northern Railroad and still retained the number. Then later on it was retired, and in 1973 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today and can be seen on display as well. Also, like in 2009 or 2010 till 2014, it was going under a cosmetic restoration by being repainted and looking good as new. Also, it can be seen in this spot on display, and also you can even visit the locomotive's cab and even sit where the engineer used to sit as well.
What you see right behind me is Norfolk and Western 2156.
Norfolk and Western 2156 was built by the Norfolk and Western Roanoke shops in Roanoke, Virginia in 1942, and is the 3/17th steam locomotive built by that factory, and is a 2882 Yellowstone type steam locomotive and is a Y6A class steam locomotive. This locomotive spent its entire career working for the Norfolk and Western Railroad, and also it was even used for hauling coal on the railroad as well. Then the locomotive was retired, and in 1959 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it can be seen today. In 2014, it was loaned to the Virginia Museum of Transportation in Roanoke, Virginia, and was prepared for the movement to the museum there. In 2015, it was then carried to Roanoke by Union Pacific for the first leg of the journey, then on to Norfolk Southern, including the tracks it once ran on years ago. It stayed there until 2020 and was moved back to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis and went back in the same process in reverse. As well as that, both museums swapped items, which was the General Motors B Unit 103B, as it was with the A Unit for a while after the event Streamliners at Spencer. Also, Norfolk and Western 2156 is one of two surviving Norfolk and Western 2882s left in the world today, and 2050 is at the Illinois Railway Museum in Union, Illinois. And 2156 can be seen here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it can be seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is Missouri Pacific 4502.
Missouri Pacific 4502 was built by Alco in Schenectady, New York in 1955 and is the 80759th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is an Alco RS3 type diesel locomotive. This locomotive was originally used to work on the Missouri Pacific Railroad, and this is the original number. It would also haul and shunt freight cars for the railroad as well. Then in 1975 it was sold to the Bauxite and Northern Railway in Bauxite, Arkansas and renumbered 12. Then in 1992 the locomotive was retired because it suffered a broken crankshaft and also a private individual obtained it. Then in 1995 it was sold to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, and it was restored to its Missouri Pacific appearance from 2000 to 2006, and it was being repainted. Today it can be seen on display at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is American Steel Foundries 8.
American Steel Foundries 8 was built by Whitcomb Locomotive Works in Rochelle, Illinois in 1948 and is the 60202nd diesel locomotive built by that factory and is a 65-ton center cab type diesel locomotive. It was used by the American Steel Foundries Company in Granite City, Illinois for many years. It was likely used to shunt cars in and out of the facility as well. Then later it was retired, and in 1980 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Erie Lackawanna 3607.
Erie Lackawanna 3607 was built by Electromotive Division in LaGrange, Illinois in 1967 and is the 33107th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is an SD45 type diesel locomotive. This locomotive was originally used by the Erie Lackawanna Railroad, and this is its original number. It was even used as a freight locomotive for many years. Then, in 1976, the railroad merged to Conrail and the locomotive was renumbered 6072. Then, later on, the locomotive was retired and in 1986 was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by Conrail, where it is seen on display today. It was repainted into its Erie Lackawanna color and given its original number as well. Today, it can be found on display here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is preserved today.
What you see right behind me is Union Pacific 6944.
Union Pacific 6944 was built by Electromotive Division in LaGrange, Illinois in 1971 and is the 355/18th diesel locomotive built by that factory, and it's a DDA-40X type and also known as a Centennial. This locomotive is the 45th DDA-40X, also known as Centennial, and it was built for the Union Pacific Railroad and is one of 47 that were built. Also, it worked as a freight locomotive on the Union Pacific Railroad. The name Centennial was used to mark the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in May 1869 in Promontory, Utah. Then later on, the locomotive was retired and in 1984 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today. Also, in 2014, the locomotive was moved to Altoona, Pennsylvania to be repainted, and when the repaint was complete, it was then towed back to the museum and looking good as new. Also, Union Pacific 6944 is one of 13 surviving DDA-40X Centennials left in the world today and can be found here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today. And also, you can even ring the locomotive's bell.
And that's how it's done. What you see right behind me is Union Pacific 4006.
Union Pacific 4006 was built by Alco in Schenectady, New York in 1941 and is the 695/77th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 4884 big boy type steam locomotive, and this locomotive is known as a big boy and the locomotive's class is 48841. The big boys are one of the articulated steam locomotives built. The Big Boy is known to be the largest steam locomotive in the world, and when Big Boy 4000 rolled out of the factory in Schenectady, New York, one guy climbed on the pilot deck and chalked on the smoke box door and wrote Big Boy on it, and that's how these locos got that name, Big Boy. Also, this locomotive ran between Cheyenne, Wyoming and Ogden, Utah, and hauled freight up Sherman Hill in Wyoming when it was still operating along with the others. Then, in 1962, it was retired, and then, it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it can be seen today. In 2013, the locomotive was being repainted and the project went on till like 2015. Also, Union Pacific 4006 is one of 8 surviving big boys left in the world today and can be found here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, and you can even visit the locomotive's cab and even sit where the engineer and fireman used to sit as well.
What you see right behind me is New York Central 2933.
New York Central 2933 was built by Alco in Schenectady, New York in 1929 and is the 681/26th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 4A2 Mohawk type steam locomotive and is an L2D class steam locomotive. Originally, this locomotive was used for the Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis Railway, which is a New York Central subsidiary, and it was originally numbered 6233 and was used like for hauling freight or passenger. Then, in 1936, it was transferred to the New York Central Railroad and renumbered 2933, and also spent its life hauling passenger or freight. Then, in 1955, the locomotive was retired and it was overlooked during scrappings in 1955 to 1957 and was hidden by employees at New York Central's Selkirk Yard in Selkirk, New York until it was donated to the museum in 1962. Then in 2006 it was going under cosmetic restoration and got repainted, and it was also taken over to the yard to be repainted and cosmetically restored. Then the cosmetic restoration was completed in 2017 and the locomotive was looking good as new once again. Also, New York Central 2933 is one of 2 surviving New York Central 482s left in the world today, and 3001 is the other one and is at the National New York Central Railroad Museum in Elkhart, Indiana, and 2933 can be found here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Union Pacific 2804.
Union Pacific 2804 was built by General Electric in Schenectady, New York in 1966 and is the 360/18th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is a U-28C type diesel locomotive. This locomotive spent its life working as a freight locomotive on the Union Pacific Railroad, and it is one of 10 delivered to Union Pacific the year it was built and numbered from 2800 to 2809. And this locomotive had been working for the Union Pacific Railroad for many years. Then later on, it was retired, and in 1995, it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is on display today. Also, the locomotive's shell that goes over the engine is not there because it is so it can show you how a diesel locomotive works, as it's the cutaway locomotive in the museum as well.
What you see right behind me is Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 192.
Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 192 was built by the Budd Company in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1938 and is a dining car. This car is one of 3 diners built by the Budd Company. Also, the coach is named Silver Spoon. This car was used on the built for Zephyr service. The original Simon was on the Aristocrat operating between Chicago, Illinois and Denver, Colorado. Also, this car is where people would have a meal on board while riding the train. 3 diners spent most of their careers as spare cars in the Zephyr fleet. They were used on the Twin Cities Zephyrs in 1947 during the period after the 9904 to 9905 articulated train sets were assigned to the Nebraska Zephyrs and before the new dining cars were delivered in 1948. This car illustrates the pre-war Budd design for the Zephyr fleet, with screwed-in windows, cutouts in the lower fluting for the trucks, and inboard truck-mounted brake cylinders. Then later on it was retired and then came to be part of the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, and seen on display in this spot where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Frisco 1522.
Frisco 1522 was built by Baldwin in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1926 and is the 591 34th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 4A2 mountain type steam locomotive and is a 1500 class steam locomotive. This locomotive was used for freight and passenger service. Also, it is one of many Frisco 4A2s that were built by Baldwin. The first batch of 15 numbered from 1500 to 1514 built in 1923 and the last 10 numbered from 1520 to 1529 and built in 1926, and it is one of the ones numbered from 1520 to 1529. It was designed to haul passenger trains, but were mainly assigned to heavy freight runs. It was built as a coal burner, but was converted to burn oil sometime in the 1930s. Also, the trailing axle under the cab is powered by a small 2-cylinder booster engine at low speeds, adding power for starting trains or on hills. In 1951, it was retired from revenue service and in 1958 was donated to the museum by the St. Louis San Francisco, Frisco for short. A group of steam fans known as the St. Louis Steam Train Association then restored the engine to operating condition. It had its inaugural run to Decatur, Illinois in 1988 and then ran in many different states. Then, in 2002, the locomotive was retired a second time and also came to be back on display at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it can be seen on display. Also, the reason it had to be retired a second time was because the association announced it could no longer afford to operate the locomotive because of high insurance costs. On September 28 that year, the locomotive ran a farewell excursion and the next day steamed back into retirement. A lot of people even say it should be restored again someday, but I'm not sure if that'll happen in the future, but you never know what the future has in store with this locomotive. Also, Frisco 1522 is one of 6 surviving Frisco 482s left in the world today, and 1522 can be found here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 9939A.
Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 9939A was built by Electromotive Division in LaGrange, Illinois in 1950 and is the 9677th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is an E8A type diesel locomotive. This locomotive was used to pull passenger trains across the system for many years. Then, in 1970, after the Burlington Northern merger, it kept the number. Then, in 1973, it was rebuilt by Morrison Knutson in Boise, Idaho as an E9A and renumbered 9902. Then it was transferred to the newly created Chicago Regional Transportation Authority in 1974, which became Metra in 1984. Then it was sold to Maryland Department of Transportation, MARC for short, and was renumbered 64. Then later on the locomotive was retired and in 1992 was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, and was restored to how it originally looked. Today it is preserved at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it can be seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is Southern Pacific 4460.
Southern Pacific 4460 was built by Lima Locomotive Works in Lima, Ohio in 1941 and is the 8013th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 484 Northern type steam locomotive and is a GS6 class steam locomotive. This locomotive was used for passenger service for the Southern Pacific Railroad and also was used during World War II. The engine was the first GS6 ever manufactured and is famous for pulling what's supposed to be the final movement of steam on the Southern Pacific Railroad in 1958. It made the final run, which was from Reno, Nevada to Oakland, California, and a local scout bugler from the Bay Area Council played taps for the funeral of the 4460, and it was staged by the Southern Pacific Railroad in 1958. Then it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today. Also, Southern Pacific 4460 is one of two remaining GS-class steam locomotives and is one of two remaining Southern Pacific 484s left in the world today. And 4449 is the other one and is the daylight locomotive and is a cousin of this loco, and it lives in Portland, Oregon at the Oregon Rail Heritage Center, and 4460 can be found here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Lake Street Elevated 9.
Lake Street Elevated 9 was built by the Rhode Island Locomotive Works in Providence, Rhode Island in 1893 and is the 2943rd steam locomotive built by that factory and is an 044T Forney type steam locomotive. Also, the locomotive is named Charles H. The locomotive was used originally for the Lake Street Elevated Railroad in Chicago, Illinois, and this is the original name. It ran on the Lake Street L, and Chicago's first elevated trains were hauled by steam locomotives like this one. This is also the original number it had. Then later on, it was sold to the Ozone Lumber Company in Hampton, Louisiana, and renumbered 8. Then, in 1947, it was sold to the McGraw Steel Company in Rusk, Texas. Then later was sold to Varencia Iron and Coke S.A. in Monclova and renumbered 1. Then it was sold to La Consolidada, South Africa. Then it came back to the United States of America after that. Then, later on, the locomotive was retired, and in 1957 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, and restored as far as possible to its 1893 appearance in 1995 to 1996. In 1997, the locomotive was displayed in downtown Chicago in commemoration of the Chicago Transit Authority's 50th anniversary, and then returned to the museum. It was moved from some certain spots in the building it's under till it eventually ended up in this spot where it is. Today, it can be found here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Nickel Plate Road 170.
Nickel Plate Road 170 was built by Alco Brooks in Dunkirk, New York in 1927 and is the 672/11th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 464 Hudson type steam locomotive and is an L1A class steam locomotive. This locomotive was designed to haul heavy passenger trains on the Nickel Plate Road Railroad. It was the second Hudson type steam locomotive built. It also ran passenger service between Buffalo, New York and Chicago, Illinois. This locomotive remained in service until 1947 when passenger trains on the Nickel Plate Road were taken over by diesels. But the locomotive continued in freight service for some years. Then later on it was retired and in 1957 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the Nickel Plate Road, and it can be seen on display right here as well. Also, Nickel Plate Road 170 is the only remaining Nickel Plate Road 464 left in the world today and can be found here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it can be seen on display today. And also, it is known to be the oldest surviving Hudson-type steam locomotive as well.
What you see right behind me is Chesapeake, Ohio 2727.
Chesapeake, Ohio 2727 was built by Alco in Schenectady, New York in 1944 and is the 708/76th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 284 Kanawha type steam locomotive and is a K4 class steam locomotive. This locomotive and the other 284s from the Chesapeake and Ohio were named Kanawhas, and however, most of the 284s are normally called Berkshires, but ones from the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad are known as a Kanawha, as it is classified as a Kanawha for a West Virginia river that flows through the Chesapeake and Ohio's operating area. Also, it is one of the first 40 of its type numbered from 2700 to 2739. The locomotive was designed to pull heavy and fast freight through the Allegheny Mountain country of Virginia and West Virginia. The K4s were designed to haul the fast freight schedule demanded by World War II demands. They were based on the 284 design used on the Nickel Plate Road and Pere Marquette, which was common to the four railroads controlled by the Van Sweringen brothers. The K4s were extremely successful and operated over most of the Chesapeake and Ohio railroad system, hauling passenger trains as well as freight. Then it was retired, and in 1956 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, where it is today. Also, Chesapeake and Ohio 2727 is one of 12 surviving Chesapeake and Ohio 284s left in the world today, and 2727 can be found here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it can be seen today.
What you see right behind me is Wabash 573.
Wabash 573 was built by the Rhode Island Locomotive Works in Providence, Rhode Island in 1899 and is the 3147th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 260 Mogul type steam locomotive and is an F4 class steam locomotive. This locomotive spent its life working for the Wabash Railroad many years ago and originally was numbered 754. Then in 1915 it was renumbered 573. This locomotive might have worked as a freight locomotive for the railroad. Then it was retired and in 1955 it was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the Wabash Railroad. In 2012, it was soon going under cosmetic restoration, and it had been repainted and being worked on inside and out, and so was the tender. Then in 2017, it was fully complete. Today, it is the only surviving Wabash 260 left in the world today and is preserved here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Boston and Providence 17.
Boston and Providence 17 was built by the Boston and Providence Roxbury shops in Roxbury, Massachusetts in 1858 and is a 440 American-type steam locomotive. Also, the locomotive is named Daniel Nason. The locomotive was originally built for the Boston and Providence Railroad, and this is the original name and number. The locomotive is a design popular prior to the Civil War. Then, in 1888, it was leased to the Old Colony Railroad and renumbered 170. Then, in 1893, it was then leased to the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. Then, in 1905, the lease ended, and then it was loaned to Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. And then, in 1939, the loan ended, and that year, it was displayed at the New York's World Fair. Then, in 1951, it was sold to John Leahy of Danbury, Connecticut, and he owned it till his death in 1975. Then later on, the locomotive was retired, and in 1982, the locomotive was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri by the Friends of the Danbury Collection, and it can be seen on display here at the museum where it is today. Also, the locomotive is the only surviving example of the Dutch wagon practice where steam cylinders are inside the locomotive frame, a design popular prior to the Civil War, and as well as that, it is the only remaining Boston and Providence steam locomotive left in the world today, and it can be found here at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where it is today. Well, I hope you all enjoyed learning about trains with me today in Matthew Lapp Train Guy segment show. Also, I hope to see you all again in the next segment, and if you didn't subscribe to my channel yet, the subscribe button is just below the video screen, and it's free to subscribe, so don't be afraid to. Also, if you didn't give the Facebook page a like yet, here's where you can find it. And if you didn't follow the Instagram page yet, here's where you can find it as well. Be sure to give the Facebook page a like as well as the Instagram page a follow if you didn't yet. And also, be sure to get your merch at teesprings.com. Link is in the description box below, along with the Facebook page and Instagram page. And remember to subscribe to the Train Guy. So this is Matthew Lapp, host of Matthew Lapp Train Guy segment show, signing out. Until next time, all aboard!